As I was putting the message together this week, I called this story that I heard a few years ago that really, it put life in such a great perspective for me. Maybe you've heard it before. It was this older man, and he always really enjoyed Sunday mornings. He enjoyed the silent moments in the morning when he'd wake up before anyone else, and the birds were chirping outside the window. The sun was rising, just barely peeking over the horizon. He knew he didn't have to work that day, so he could drink his nice hot cup of coffee and not have to worry about the tasks that he might have to do. He could wake up early, drink that coffee, get dressed, go to worship with his family, with the rest of the church. He really enjoyed Sundays. He loved them. And he said he really learned to enjoy all of that when he decided he would do a little math. That kind of piqued my interest, and he realized the average person lived about 75 years. Now, he knew that there were a few people who lived longer, and some didn't make it quite that long, but for the most part, it was about 75 years, and he decided, I'm going to multiply 75 by 52 for every week in the year. So we got 3,900. That's 3,900. And he figured if there's 52 weeks every year, then he'd get 52 wonderful Sundays every year to spend, his favorite day. But the problem came, and he realized, wait a minute, I'm already 55. So he did some more math, and he figured I had a little bit less than 20 years left, and when it was all said and done, he had about almost exactly 1,000 Sundays left. So he immediately went to the store, and he bought a bag of these, well, a few bags of these, if we got some pictures there, of marbles. And he'd set these marbles on a counter in his house, maybe his kitchen counter, his bedroom counter, and every Sunday morning, he would wake up, and he'd take one of those marbles, and he'd throw it in the trash. He'd throw it in the trash can. And he learned to enjoy Sunday because he could see those marbles every week, every month, every year pass away slowly, dwindle down. And he then remarked that earlier that day, he drank his hot cup of coffee, and he got dressed. He held hands with his wife and gave her a kiss as they left, and they drove to church to worship, and then afterwards they ate lunch with his children and grandchildren. And when he was telling this story, he was just grinning ear to ear and with such content, such joy in his heart. And when they asked him, why are you so happy about this? Why are you grinning? It's just a normal Sunday. You say you do this every week. And he just calmly said, I smile because right before I drank that coffee this morning, right before I held hands with my wife and kissed her and worshiped my Savior, spent time with my family, that morning I threw away my very last marble in the trash can. And I'm content now knowing that if I live to see another Sunday, it's just a blessing. But if I don't make it to the next Sunday, well, then I know that I made the most of the Sundays that I had left. And I love that. And I don't know about you, but I sort of want to be like that older man. I want to make the most of my time on earth count for something, and I want to make sure that I don't lose sight of the things that are most important in this life. And in the passage Jeff read for us earlier from Luke chapter 14, Jesus sort of addresses this same idea about being his disciple, about making time count. So if you would, that's where we're going to be camped out today. You can turn over to Luke chapter 14. It's in the middle of your Bible, right after Matthew and Mark. It's the third gospel there. And we're in our 6th week of our series about the parables. And Mark's really dug into some great parables thus far. But if I'm honest, today's is sort of, well, it's often overlooked. Rarely it's mentioned probably when you talk about the great stories Jesus told. And in fact, it's not even really the most popular parable or story in this chapter. But regardless of its popularity, I believe that this story from Jesus here has such great significance for our lives like it did the crowds and the disciples when they first heard it. And it all has to do with, number one, being a follower of Jesus, a disciple, and also making your lifetime count. So if you would, let's read together. We'll start in verse 25 of Luke 14 and sort of work our way through. It starts by saying this: large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned to them and he said this. This is Jesus speaking. He said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And he goes on to say in the next verse, whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. But we know that Jesus, after this, is about to really lay down the context of what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be a follower of his. He's going to talk about the terms or the rules, if you want to call them, of what it means to be a disciple, how you live to follow him. But what we need to do is we need to establish the context within which Jesus is about to say these really important, serious words. And we see in verse 25, large crowds are traveling with him. But they're not really just traveling from city to city, business as usual with Jesus. This is sort of a different journey they're on here. They're currently embarking on arguably Jesus' most important journey, and that's the journey to the cross. They're heading to Jerusalem, where it's going to soon be extremely difficult to follow Jesus and be a disciple. Jesus is soon going to be crucified, and he's going to die on the cross, and that's going to mark an extremely difficult period in time where it's hard to proudly say, yeah, I follow that Jesus, the guy that you can see hanging dead on the cross. I thought he was going to conquer all my enemies and live forever, but yeah, I follow him, including those who persecute him and hung him there. Yeah, I follow that guy. It's going to be hard to do that. So on their way to this massive sort of test of their faith, Jesus sort of prefaces that test with, well, what it seems to be sort of another test. And I know it sort of seems like Jesus is making it difficult to follow him by questioning their commitment over and over, but what he's actually doing here is he's making it abundantly clear what it's going to take to be a follower of his. He wants everyone to realize what they're getting into when they say, yeah, I want to be a Christian, I want to be a follower. There should be no questions, Jesus says, about the cost because I already outlined them beforehand. So he's already done that with his disciples, and now he's doing it again with the crowds here, and he's hammering home this point. The disciples have made their commitment. They're all in, but he wants to make sure the crowds, everyone who hears, and then years later, understand this is what it's going to take to be a disciple. And possibly the craziest thing about this is Jesus, who's known for, well, overwhelming love and grace, is starting this call with these words in verse 26. He starts the invitation. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yeah, even your own life, well, you can't be my disciple. And I'm not really an expert on how to start a letter or write an invitation, but that really doesn't sound like a great way to start one out. Hate? Really, Jesus? I mean, you're telling me if I want to follow you, got to hate everyone. You expect a great commitment and participation after that? Well, I think where I've missed this point before, and a lot of us do, is when Jesus says the word hate there, it's not really hate in the sense that we understand it and use it. It's really this Hebrew idiom that essentially means this. It means love less than, love less. In other words, Jesus doesn't want you to hate anyone. He never preached messages of hate. He just doesn't want you to love anything more than him. You don't have to hate those people or hate those things, but just love them less than me. He's speaking on the key word for today, which is this, prioritizing. Prioritizing. It's on a list. Everything's a little bit lower than Jesus. He's on the top of the list. Love less than. Look at how Jesus first says it back in Matthew chapter 10. He's sending his disciples out for the first time, and he says this, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy. It's more prioritizing in order from top to bottom rather than just simply you have to choose between one or the other. I think New Living Translation actually makes Luke 14 pretty clear if we can pull that one up. It's the same verse, but it says it in a different way. It says, if you want to be my disciples, you must by comparison hate everyone else, your father, mother, wife, children, so on and so forth. By comparison being the key words there. In other words, kingdom and Jesus are over everything else and everyone else. We can put it this way, kingdom and Jesus is greater than, and you fill in the blank, everything. You don't have to hate anyone, but the way you love Jesus should be far greater than the stuff you buy and get, the people you love. There's nothing wrong with that, but Jesus just comes first. In fact, when you love Jesus so greatly and you place the kingdom first, it actually enables you to love others more. What it does is it actually increases your capacity to love and be loved. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus is once again speaking on peace, division, his purpose, and he says these words starting in verse 49. He says, I've come to bring fire on earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. He says, but I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I'm under until it's completed. But then he says these words after that. He says, do you think I came to peace, or to earth to bring peace? And everyone's probably saying, well, yeah, of course. And he says, no, division. I came to bring division. And he goes on to say, from now on, there's families of 5 divided, 2 against 3, 3 against 2. They'll be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, so on and so forth. He makes it clear that division's going to happen. It's strong, tight-knit family and friends. And it makes sense why he says, you have to love them less than me. We're going to come. Discipleship in this passage means three things, and the first one's this: you give your first loyalty. You pledge your first loyalty, your first priority to Jesus. You prioritize Jesus first, and, well, everything just sort of flows from there. But if that wasn't enough, Jesus he takes a shot at our ego a little bit, doesn't he? And he says, not only do I mean family, but I also mean, well, you too. In other words, you got to place Jesus above yourself. Your own self-interest, your own wants, your own desires. All that takes a back seat to the kingdom. And that's hard to hear. Especially in a world that's screaming at you to love yourself, put yourself first, just do what makes you happy. Jesus says, no, that all comes second to me and my kingdom. In fact, he goes so far to foreshadow his own death and call us really to a similar fate in 27 when he says, carry our cross, which is the second thing discipleship means, cross-bearing. Jesus wants it to be known up front that, well, being a Christian is not always going to be easy. It's not. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card you can just play anytime you want to. At times, it's going to be extremely difficult. It's not some bait-and-switch technique where Jesus gives you the good stuff and then, you find out the bad stuff later. No, he's being very clear up front before he even explains the prioritization. This is what the price is going to be. Before we even get to the parable, Jesus said, hey, you got to know this first. This is important. He wants us to understand and realize what we're getting into when we say, yeah, we're Christians, we're disciples, we're followers. He wants you to have a faith that stands the test of time and trials, so count the cost up front. When things get hard or they get difficult, when bad things happen to you or to people you love, when following Jesus gets messy, he wants you to be able to say, you know what? I'm going to stand firm and continue to follow him. Even when the world, the problems of the world, Satan, other people, even you are saying, I don't know about that. You see, your priority list changes significantly when you follow Jesus. He even says, well, if we don't prioritize correctly, well, we can't be his disciples. In fact, this passage here has 3 times up here the sentence, cannot be my disciple or my disciples. 26, 27, and later on in verse 33. 3 times he says, well, if this doesn't happen, you can't be my disciple. But Jesus does this because of these harsh words we're going to read here in Revelation 3. He says, I know your deeds. You're neither hot nor cold. I wish you were either of those. But because you're lukewarm, not hot or cold, well, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. Simply put, there is no such thing as half-hearted, halfway-in Christianity. It doesn't exist. And Jesus is harsh here because he's condemning half-heartedness. He doesn't want followers who rush into discipleship without thinking of what's involved with it. He doesn't want disciples who can't prioritize their lives wisely. So he makes the imagery to the cross to get us to understand the seriousness of following him, of being a Christian. We have to have a willingness to, face martyrdom, to die, to endure great personal sacrifice in order to follow him. He wants us to know that up front. And not just once in your life, by the way. He says in Luke chapter 9, when he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross. When? Daily, every day. Whoever wants to save their life is going to lose it. Whoever loses their life for me will save it. The key word is daily. Every day you have to prioritize wisely. Every day you have to sacrifice. Every day you have to have that willingness to lay it down for him. Everything must be put at risk for the sake of the kingdom. And someone who's prepared to abandon their possessions behind and follow him, that's a sign that they understand the seriousness nature of Jesus' invitation here. He says at that point, you've truly, counted the cost, which is why they often call this parable counting the cost. You understand the third thing about discipleship, and that is you are all in. Not half, all the way, or nothing. It's sort of like jars. If you've ever seen the illustration with jars and rocks and pebbles and sand, I'm sure many of you have. If you haven't, we'll catch you up. We got some pictures up there. Rather than do it for you, I'll just show you the pictures. If you want to fill those jars there, obviously there's 2 ways to do it, or multiple ways, I guess, if you can find some more. But you can fill these jars with rocks and pebbles and sand. Both jars, the same size, the same amount of material, filled completely differently. You could start with the sand and the pebbles. They go in there easy, and then cram in the big rocks later, but what happens? They don't fit. There's no space left. Or you could start by making sure you got to get the big rocks in first, and then the pebbles and sand, when they pour in, they just sort of fill those empty cracks in space like the jar on the right. And those big rocks, I guess, would represent, well, your top priorities. You know, kingdom things. Things that are the most important in life. A relationship with Jesus. His church. Fellowship with other believers. Raising your children in the faith. God's word, prayer, things like that. And those pebbles are great too. They're just not quite as big as the rocks. They're things Jesus said sort of take a back seat to him, but are still important. Things like your family, your friends, grades in school, work, finances, athletic events, extracurricular activities, things of that nature. They fit a little bit harder, but you can still get them in there. And I think the sand, which eventually takes up the most space, are those things that, man, they take up a lot of our time, a lot of our thoughts, maybe even a lot of our worries, when in the grand scheme of things, they really don't matter that much. And often what they end up doing is if you put them in first, they clog up that important room, causing the big rocks to be left out. And of course, the jars represent you and your life and me and mine. That's the prioritizing that Jesus is talking about here. If you're not willing to put the big rocks in your jar first, the kingdom things, then you're not going to realize until your jar's already filling up, or maybe it's already full, that you don't have any room left. It's difficult to empty that jar and to start all the way over. And I don't want it to be too late for some of us to realize we should have emptied the jar a long time ago, but it's too late now. It's sort of like Mark did when he had Corey up here last week, and Corey was carrying, I think, everything Mark owned, and he finally at the end tried to shove in a Bible, and it's like, you can't carry that, right? It gets messy when we fail to prioritize wisely. I think Mark Twain once famously said, to change your life, you have to first change your perspective. Because we all know too many priorities means no top priority. What prioritizing does is it causes you to ask a very important question. That's Jesus' first is, does this really matter for eternity, for mine, for others? And if so, well, then it does matter. It's a kingdom matter. It is a priority. But if not, is it really that important? And that brings us to our first building block. You know, Mark said we're going to have a building block every week in this series of the parables. I've actually got two for you today, and the first one is this: first things first. Well, kingdom things first. If we're to keep first things first, then those first things should be, well, kingdom things. The big rocks in your jar, right? And now that Jesus has sort of hammered home the idea to keep the main thing, so to speak, he tells two really quick, short, poignant parables within this sort of larger story. We can call them the builder and the king. We'll just read them both together. There's just a couple verses there. Let's read them starting in 28. It says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Why don't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? And he goes on to say, for if you lay the foundation and you're not able to finish, everyone who sees it is going to ridicule you, and they're going to say, well, that person began to build, but they didn't finish. That's the builder. Or how about the king? He says, suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Well, won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? And then he goes on to say, if he's not able, he's going to send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and ask for peace. And then he ends it by saying this: in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything, there it is again, cannot be my disciples. See, both the builder and the king illustrate Jesus' larger points, which are you have to count the cost of discipleship, and you got to be willing to give up a lot, everything, for him. First, you've got this builder. He's free to choose to build. He can build if he wants to or not. He can build as high or as tall as he wants to. It's up to him. He might even choose the right foundation in this case, but where he fails is he doesn't stop to think, do I have enough money to complete this task? And then he's got to quit building. In other words, he literally doesn't count the cost. He fails to ask Jesus' question, and that's this: can you afford to follow me? And he's not talking just about money. He's talking about your life. Can you afford to follow me? You can build this massive building with the wrong foundation. What it's going to do, it's just going to fall over. You can build the right foundation, and when you're building up, maybe you get sidetracked along the way and it's either going to fail structurally or you're going to have to quit and start over again. Or maybe you can start with the right foundation and like the builder, you never finish the job. It's no wonder Jesus says you got to count the cost beforehand and carry your cross daily on the way up. Because Christianity is a lifelong build. It's a journey you're on. You need the 3 F's of this parable here. He says you need the right foundation is number 1, foundation of Christ, the rock to build upon. You need the second F, which is the right faith to live by. If you don't have a faith that's enduring, you'll never make it on the build up. And then you need simply the third F to finish strong. And all those verses there are great. I encourage you to read them this week. We really don't have time to go through all those, but what they do is they emphasize the reason you need to build your foundation correctly on Christ and have a faith that lasts tests and trials on the way up. So read those this week. But nevertheless, after the builder, you have the king, who likewise has some decision to make, but he doesn't have, quite the same freedom as the builder does. He's being invaded, and he's sort of got to act quickly. He's got to count the cost now, and he's got to ask Jesus his third question, can you afford to refuse my invitation to follow? Can you afford to refuse it? You can act urgently, you can delegate. You can count the cost and understand what you're up against, or, you're going to fail to do so and be invaded. So you can choose to seek to end the battle peacefully, or you can lose the battle altogether, Jesus says. See, like the builder, we all have this personal choice to make. We're free to choose to make it. The question is, will we follow him? And we're also like the king in a way. We have to decide, and you need to do so with urgency because, you just never know when your time's up, do you? We've got to prioritize. The question just becomes, will you do so wisely? Someone once said, if it's a priority to you, you're going to find a way. But if it's not, you're going to find an excuse. I don't want us to make excuses as to why we're putting off the decision to follow Jesus. I don't want us to make excuses to why he's not been and isn't the top priority in our life. And I don't want us to make excuses when things get hard because we failed to count the cost up front. And when things do get hard, we feel like giving up or we blame God for something that was never his fault in the first place. I like to think the way we count the cost and even the way the builder and the king counted the cost in sort of 2 forms of measurement. The clock and the compass. I think about this clock here, and I hope it's the right time, but it's the clock. It's how most of us, I say, would probably count the cost. We watch it constantly. Rather than being guided by the compass, it measures time instead. We live by these full schedules and these numerous activities we have. We live by the many commitments that we have to watch the clock for, the appointments that are packed into our calendars, these lofty goals we set for ourselves. You see, that clock there will tell you how long it takes to get home, but it's not going to guide you there. And then I think about this compass here. This compass is how some of us tend to count the cost as well. We get caught up in being guided. We sort of lose track of time. We forget to watch the clock as well. And the compass guides you. It directs you. It does a lot of great things. It conveys this vision, this mission, guiding principles even. But when we enjoy this sense of wonder and travel, we sort of get caught up in the journey itself, and we forget a sense of time and commitment we have. You see, a compass, it's going to get you home, but it fails to tell you how long it takes to do so. Both the clock and the compass have their strengths, but neither do the job perfectly well. The builder was sort of like the compass a little bit, right? He wanted the grand idea of building, and he liked the idea of building it tall, but he forgot to complete in a timely manner. And the king's sort of like the clock. He gets caught up in all his duties as a king, his commitments, and he's invaded because he lost his sense of looking out in front of him and doing it in a timely fashion. It seems as if the only way to sort of balance these 2 measurements is to sort of bridge that gap, be mindful of both and the compass. But what measurement can effectively bridge that gap? Well, to me, I think, and to Jesus too, the third C measurement would be the cross. Now, the one I have is not very big. You can look at the one behind me or the one on the screen, but I think the cross is really the only tool, the only measurement tool that causes you to seriously assess the cost of following and simultaneously compel you to take action and do something about it. The cross reveals your purpose and your meaning for your life in a way that the clock and the compass fail to do so. When you look to the cross, you see Jesus, you see Christ, you see purpose, meaning, love, truth, this perfect gift wrapped into one present, and it's free. You're cognizant of both the direction of your life, like the compass, and the time you have to carry it out, like the clock. Your decision to follow Jesus may not always be an easy one, but you're doing as Jesus asked. You're counting the cost and prioritizing by doing, well, the most important things first. You're placing Christ at the center of your life. And when you prioritize correctly by placing Christ at the center, you're sort of doing like the jar you're filling with the big rocks first. And everything else, the pebbles, the sand, that's just going to fall into place so much easier than trying to cram those big rocks in at the end. And Jesus sort of finishes this passage here by saying salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, well, how's it going to be made salty again? It's neither fit for the soil nor the manure pile. It's thrown out. And then he says, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. You know, we're called to be the salt of the earth. Jesus spends a significant portion of the Sermon on the Mount teaching that, discussing that, salt to the world around us. He calls us to be salt, but without flavor, without saltiness, what good is salt? It can't preserve food. It can't make it taste any better, so what's the point? Can't even break down the manure in the dirt, Jesus says. In other words, it's useless. It's a waste, so it gets, thrown in the trash. Likewise, what good are we if we fail to put Christ at the center of our lives and fail to prioritize wisely? I don't want us to be like trash salt. I don't want us to be like the builder. I don't want us to be like the king. I don't simply want to watch the clock and forget direction in life. I don't simply want to blindly be guided by the compass and forget that I don't have much time left. I want to be a disciple. Count the cost. Follow wholeheartedly. I want to look to the cross instead. And as Jesus concludes with, we've got ears and we've heard, but the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? And that's our second building block today. Not counting the cost is going to cost you all that really counts. I don't want to be like the builder and the king. They failed to count the cost, and it cost them everything that counts. Can you afford to miss out on a relationship with the creator of the universe who sent his son into the world to save you because he loves you that much, and he doesn't want to miss out on eternity with you? Unlike the builder and the king, urgently decide in your life who Jesus is to you. Where is he on your priority list? Your life may just depend on that decision. Count the cost of following Christ. Begin to build a life that lasts for eternity. Prioritize Jesus and his kingdom above everything else in your life. Let's pray.